You're listening to Data Science Leaders, the premier podcast for executives tackling the world's most important challenges using the power of machine learning. Let's dive in. AI governance. It's essential not just because of legal compliance and the risk to your reputation, but also for driving trust and adoption and impact with AI. So today we are extraordinarily lucky to have with us two folks who have been in the trenches working through data governance processes and some of the most regulated use cases that are out there, and who now regularly consult and advise on AI governance best practices. So we have with us Jared Vaudry. He is Chief Data Scientist here at Domino Data Lab. He was a data science consultant developing models across a range of industries, from financial services and media to manufacturing. Used to lead data science teams before finally becoming the CEO of the data science consulting firm A42 Labs, from which we poached him away here to Domino. We also have with us Dr. Dylan Bobby Story, who is a Senior Director for Data Science Services here at Domino. Years of experience developing and implementing AI models in heavily regulated industries such as banking and electronic payments. However, his data and data engineering skills and experience go way back, going all the way to his doctoral work in genomic life sciences. Jared and Dylan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Well, Dylan, could I impose on you to give us an overview? What are we really talking about when it comes to AI governance in organizations today? What does it look like? What are they thinking about?
Yes, I guess we'll start with maybe a definition of AI governance for those of us who maybe are a little unclear on that. And it's really the comprehensive set of principles, policies, and practices that are designed to ensure that responsible AI development is AI is developed and used responsibly within an organization. So, you start off with the principles there, like, what do you care about as a company? If you think back to some of our large FANG friends, do no evil, right? Or maybe it's, minimize harm. What are your principles as a company? And then you take those principles forward and make sure that your people are aware of those principles and are educated well on them. And how do those principles then apply to the systems and the type of work that you're doing around AI? Now, the other loaded section here is AI. What is AI? I think in the last few years, AI has been generative AI, LLMs for everybody in the room. But I think here at Domino, we like to take a much more expansive view of what AI is it's really an all-encompassing term for traditional machine learning models, statistics, deep learning neural networks, any sort of NLP processes, computer vision, even expert systems and rule-based, where you just encoded human behavior as a bunch of if-then statements, and then generative AI models. It's really about any system where you're automating or augmenting human decision capabilities and support, and making sure that you understand the risks associated with those, and that those systems are behaving in a way that you and the people of your company find are acceptable. Not just acceptable from an operational standpoint, but from an ethical and moral standpoint as well.
And when taking that more comprehensive view of artificial intelligence as being the traditional advanced analytics and machine learning, as well as more the latest and greatest generative AI, is it fair to say, well, in organizations that have been using these technologies for a long time, they've had governance processes in place? So thinking of financial services or in pharmaceuticals, that they haven't necessarily been calling it AI governance, but it is effectively a set of governance practices around AI that they've already had in place and are doing. Or is it fair to say that we really should be thinking of this new and different?
I'm going to come down on the side of that it's not new or different. It's much more an extension of, it's all the stuff you may have been doing before. But now that newer technologies are coming in, and even when we come back to computer vision, just 5 years ago when that came in, it's how, as these new technologies and techniques come in, they bring with them their own set of operational sharp edges, not just from a technology standpoint, but from how society interacts with them. And you get to generative AI, and I think the interesting thing about generative AI has been, one, it's a natural language interface, and it became very, very easy to do certain things with, like have it interact directly with your customers, right? And that all of a sudden opens up a whole new set of risks. And then the way that data is collected, right? There's certain biases where you can look at how data was collected and then how the responses of the machine system itself are operating. Then it's like it's a new set of risks. If you train it on bad data, or you put a bunch of racist data into a chatbot, it's going to respond with very racist things. And that's an uncomfortable thing to think about and talk about, because why would anyone do that intentionally? And the answer is they don't. most people don't intentionally go out and try to do these things. They do it in a silo. They don't maybe get peer review. They don't get someone else's opinion, and then all of a sudden, it's in production and it's on Twitter and it's destroying your brand reputation, and nobody knows where this thing came from. And so, really, for governance, it's about getting people in the room and saying, how do we help each other do the right thing? And the hard part, I think, is getting a group of people together and not stalling out everything, right? It's how do you do this in a way that's lightweight enough that you can iterate and you can innovate, where governance isn't a burden, but it's something that's just part of your normal flow and it doesn't get in the way. I think it's a lot like good security, right? What is it? The saying is, the best security is security that will be adopted, not necessarily the one that's going to cause the most friction. Because if it's not adopted, it doesn't work.
Yes, and above all, make this scalable so that we can expand governance to a whole host of new use cases and projects around the business in a way where previously it was fairly confined to a smaller set of projects. But it does sound like in what you were saying that, well, the fundamentals are the same. The foundation is going to be the same, whether or not you're doing this for traditional machine learning or for generative AI. Unfortunately, it's probably also going to be more complicated when it comes to genAI. So you still needed to do everything that you needed to do before, but potentially weren't doing, but should have been doing. But by the way, you're going to need to add on top of this, there are going to be additional guardrails that you need to put in place when it comes to generative AI. And by the way, you're also going to need to make this scalable in a way that previously you could have very heavy processes around governance that now you need to make more lightweight, automated, seamless to support more use cases. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's a great paraphrasing. And I think the last part on why it's hard is that for generative AI especially, it's captured the imagination of non-technical people and not just technical people. And so non-technical people are able to access these technologies much easier. And when I say technical here, I mean data scientists. I mean, obviously technical people from a coding standpoint, or maybe not. Maybe they just know a little bit of Python. But it's relatively simple to go out there and bootstrap a small AI agent that maybe does something without having a bunch of deep expertise in the area. And so the risk is really more about, in my mind, the increased risk that I think a lot of people are seeing is more around it's a larger plane because it's so much easier to access, and it's capturing the imagination of your CEOs out there like, this is just cool. You feel like you're in Star Trek, so they're pushing more for it as well. And so I think that's the other hard part.
Congratulations. It's more democratized than ever before, and so it can be accessed by more people than ever before. By the way, you now have a much larger governance problem than you had before.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that drives a lot of the requirements now around modern AI governance to be more flexible, right? So not even 10 years ago when we were working in baking, you would not be able to use SVMs, neural nets, even XGBoost random forest, because it was hard to quantify the impact of various inputs or variables on your outcome. And I think, over the last few years, there's been a big push to essentially make these systems more flexible. Use things like shapely value and so forth that can now be used as proxies and ways to start ticking the box from a regulatory and governance standpoint so that you can start using some of these more complex algorithms and approaches. Certainly that's kind of pushed a big change, I think. And I'm not sure if the industry is fully solved for that yet, but there's definitely more flexibility now and the ability to use these algorithms, whereas 10 years ago it was just a straight up no, right? If you get away from regression or so forth, it was killer on any model that would fit under any kind of regulation, whether that's the MRM space or other.
Well, I would like to take a step back and look at what governance looks like at advanced organizations today. What are sort of the best practices there that we should be looking to adopt more broadly for this greater number of use cases? Could you give a rough sense of what the governance process would look like at a fairly advanced, mature organization?
I mean, I'm still seeing a lot of this very sequential process. So the business unit or business owner will come to a data science team or a team of quants, et cetera, and come with a business problem. And then you try to solve that with some quantitative method. There's then some project which goes from getting data to exploratory data analysis, the feature engineering around that, training an algorithm or selecting an algorithm and then training it, measuring the effectiveness and trying to estimate how that will work in production when data it hasn't seen before, and then kind of setting up that deployment system and measurement around that. it's still a very sequential process, even at the most advanced organizations today, where at that point, the team needs to pull together all their artifacts, whether that's code, pulling out the EDA graphs and images and so forth, the logic around the features and the model parameters and so forth, to then package up, typically, even still today, as a PDF that gets kind of pushed off to then the compliance team, which may or may not pick that up immediately. So there's this kind of quantitative work's done first, and then the compliance work's done later. Over the last, I would say, not even a year, 6 months or so, there has been a lot of tools that are starting to come out to kind of start to automate that pieces of that process more. Some companies are focused very much on the data side, looking into things like data lineage and really the governance around that. Other organizations are taking what the compliance and risk team is doing, whether that's NIST or some other regulation, and having a set of requirements. So there's some levels of automation happening there, but I think where people are really starting to drive towards, and what will be the most disruptive in terms of effectiveness here, is trying to pull these two independent tracks today that are kind of sequential and try to get them running in parallel as much as possible, and embed as much automation in terms of collecting those artifacts and pulling those together. We can definitely jump into the pain points of why you want to do that, but that's kind of where things are today, at least from my view. Dylan, are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that description of sequential, even at your high functioning organizations, is very true, and I suspect it's tightly coupled to people's development life cycles. And what I think is interesting is the high functioning places, even though they are sequential, the reason they seem to be high functioning is they've taken their organizational policies and ethos and really not just created documents and said, this is the process you will follow, but they've really instilled those values and educated their people so that it's not something that they're thinking about as an afterthought. They're thinking about it as just part of who they are intrinsically and how they work. And I think that when you see that in the high functioning groups, it helps collapse some of the cycles down so that it's not one long cycle, maybe it's several smaller ones. But I would agree with the overall characterization of still very, very linear from a process perspective, and that often late to the party, to the point of maybe to the detriment of the project as well.
And I think the other kind of viewpoint here is, we're data scientists by trade, right? So we're thinking about it from the data science point of view, but the compliance and risk teams themselves have their own set of actions that come into play. The proliferation of regulations, laws, various guidance in the EU, even coming out of the White House, makes their job very difficult, right? You want to make sure that you're staying up with the latest and greatest in terms of regulations and how to actually embed those and make sure you're complying with those within your organization. So there's the other kind of side of the coin here, which, even the most advanced organizations are still, I think that they're getting much better kind of embedding those, but as they're getting it better, we're getting this exponential increase in the number of regulations and so forth that are out there. So there's a lot of rethinking the process on that side of the coin as well.
Jared, since you've given me the opportunity to drop Conway's Law into a conversation, I have of course going to take it because I can't not. I think it's really interesting that that observation I think is very true, and it kind of harkens back to Conway's Law, like when we're talking about people who are building systems around this governance of why they're struggling, and it's because they have two teams that maybe their communication structure of the organizations are they are two separate teams that only interact at the end of a project when they're arguing over whether or not it was done right. And so these systems that they build to support those processes kind of start reflecting that, and they don't work well end to end as part of the project. And so I think a lot of the struggles there are communication structures and your information architectures wind up matching each other very closely. And so wherever you can change communication structures or information architectures to move those teams closer together, they will get better, hopefully. I don't know how you solve the ever increasing diversity and homogeneity of or heterogeneity of regulations, but that's maybe a different problem for us to go tilt at those windmills later.
Yeah, I think the important piece here, though, is especially with the rise of genAI, right, and people starting to now have more focus on AI, even though it's those underlying techniques have been around for a long time. There is is a huge amount of ROI and differentiation that you can get, both from applying these techniques correctly, but also basically taking this gold mine of data that you've collected over years, decades, and now using that as a core differentiator for your products, services, whatever your organization does. So even though there are some challenges here, the flip side is if you do this well, there's a huge amount of ROI that you can capture from doing it right. So I think that's a kind of key driver in trying to figure this stuff out and do it right.
Mm. But unless you can have that trust and guarantee a certain degree of safety around this through your governance process, then it's at best you're going to get to a proof of concept or something that's not going to go into production.
Or worse, you deploy something that Dylan brought up earlier, that the ethics around this, you do something that, it happens in a silo and you deploy it and realize it's huge reputational risk, or you do something that's not compliant with regulations. And some of these fines now are going into the hundreds of millions, right, for these large banks, financial institutions, so forth. So that there's a lot of risk there in not kind of taking this into consideration and doing correctly.
Well, so it sounds like, to summarize the current state, it's not great, but there are some things that are good there. There's a kernel. There's a risk assessment, but unfortunately that risk assessment's happening too late. It's happening at the end of the project. There is documentation that is being undertaken, but again, it's happening too late. It's happening long after the fact, when you have to go back and refigure out what it was that you were doing. There is peer review, which is wonderful, but it's only happening once and very separated and takes too long. There's checkpoints and there's approval processes, but again, there are not enough of them, and they're happening usually at the end of a process. Are those the best practices that we should take away? That you have the risk assessments, have checkpoints, have documentation and track lineage and some sort of reproducibility, have definitely peer review. Are those what we should take away as the best practices for organizations today?
I think in a very narrow sense, yes, around like specific project governance, but like I think there's a bigger question there. What's the best practice for the organization, right? It's not just the model, it's they need best practices for the organization as well. And that's where I think it's things like drafting, writing, and adopting, an AI governance framework for your company. Actually go spell it out. Have a very real, serious conversation about what it is you care about as a company and what your objectives are in this space. Not every company needs to maybe care about specific social harms because they're nowhere near that space. So it's not that it's not important. It's just there are other things that are more important to them, right? So being open and having that communication, and then making sure that everyone at the company knows about it. It's internal education, it's internal communications about why this is important, kind of getting everyone on board. It's all the hard stuff of steering a group of people into one direction, not necessarily getting a technology to just work the way you want it to. I think that's, in my mind, that's the larger best practice of if you can take care of that stuff, it doesn't make the other stuff less important, but it might make it a little easier.
So then, in terms of what the consequences of this are for the organization, so they often hear folks complaining that these processes just take too long. So that a lot of models, it takes a long time to deploy them. By the time they're deployed, they're out of date. The processes are so heavyweight that you end up with models in production that don't get then updated or refreshed. Presumably, there are barriers then because some projects don't make it through this. It's the risk assessments and mitigations are happening too late, and so the products just never make it in production. So there's an effect on innovation. Presumably, there's an effect of higher risk. Are those the main impacts of ineffective or insufficient governance today?
I think about this a lot, at least from a risk standpoint. It's a book floating around by Eric Ries from the Lean Startup, and they talk about the risk of going out and developing a piece of software without touch points with your customer. You end up, if you imagine two axes, one being time and the other being risk of success, you end up building a piece of software. And at some point you hit the market with it. And there's all this risk built up in terms of, are people actually going to consume this? That's kind of applicable also here in terms of, as time goes along and a data scientist building and iterating on a model, there's all this kind of risk being built up. So I think having this kind of sharp tooth here where we're able to sync a lot along the way is extremely beneficial there. And just taking a step back too, in terms of the effectiveness of a data scientist and even their joy in working. Dylan and I were laughing the other day. We did a talk and we're joking on the chat about we have PTSD from some of these projects where you spend a long time, sometimes some sleepless nights, working, building features and getting all the data wrangled and building a model, and we do all this work at the end and hand it off to a compliance or a risk team, and you go away and you're now working on the next project, and you hear, in the case that I'm thinking of right now, a few months later, compliance is coming back and, hey, did you know that these two features were correlated? And it turns out one is a demographic feature that we can't essentially use in risk models. And at that point, all that work that you did is at risk of actually being deployed, right? So now do you go back and, well, now I've got to pull together code and my mind's off thinking about something else. I mean, it's not a very great thing from a business standpoint, getting kind of ROI from that effort, but also just in terms of employee data science satisfaction, right? Being able to feel comfortable in what you're doing and that the work that you're going to output makes an impact within the business there.
There was a head of a data science team over at RevX London who was in insurance talking about how their mission was to go in and make compliance fun. I'm not sure the degree to we can go all that far, but just the idea that it could be more frictionless, more seamless, less soul crushing and painful sounds like a wonderful reason to go work for him. That sounds like a key differentiator, both in terms of hiring and morale of your teams, versus, again, the waking up, sweating in the middle of the night, worried that compliance is going to come back to you and say, oh, sorry, your work over the last 6 months to a year is all of a sudden at risk. Or not to mention even upfront of, sorry, you can't even begin on this project. We're not going to greenlight it because we need to do a long, thorough, and potentially internal assessment of it. So in terms of what we would like, it sounds like there are a couple of things. One, we would love for governance to be much more proactive and upfront earlier on in the project lifecycle. Ideally, from the very get-go. It sounds like we would like it to be much more iterative versus a one and done more at the end. It sounds like we also want this to be more flexible, that we shouldn't be applying a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach for all projects. And we also need it to be able to help manage the complexity of multiple different regulations, depending on the use case that we're going after. And it sounds like we need for it to be very inclusive of the other stakeholders who are involved in this, to make it much more collaborative between them. Are there other things that we want in better governance that we need to be moving towards?
Just gave a long list of things to think through there.
Check it off.
Yeah, I would go back to kind of adding what Dylan mentioned earlier. I think too, there's a culture of an organization that needs to be built up, right? So that this, I don't know if it's ever going to be fun, right? But it should at least be not stressful and not become an impact into projects, right? And I think that you can't do that in a silo. It needs to be a culture of AI governance, for lack of a better word there, in terms of the definition of the culture, but, encompassing the making sure that you're compliant with regulations and guidance that's coming up, that you're thinking about the ethics of these models. And even another large piece of AI governance that we haven't talked about yet is just the general security and making sure that you're compliant within, not having issues with data leakage or anything like that within your models or access to those models.
What good is governance if you don't have security and folks can go in and access your data directly?
To echo what Jared said, and maybe to kind of follow on to the comment of we want to make governance fun. For me, I think in a perfect world, we would get rid of governance altogether. And I mean that in the sense that, like, governance, if it's the goals of governance, if it's something that's internalized, it becomes a duty, right? Kind of like a civic duty. No one likes paying their taxes, but we all do it. And granted, there's enforcement there, but I think most of us out there understand what that money goes for. We understand why it's important, and we internalize certain civic things that we have to go do. We go vote. It's inconvenient. We go do it. We go to jury duty. We go do it. If we can make governance in kind of in that same way of people kind of feel it more as a duty and something that they intrinsically understand, that the goals of governance, if it's intrinsic and it's something you just go out and do, in me, that's a perfect world, right? Governance doesn't need to exist if you just go out and do it because it's something you understand, the what, the why, and even the how. That would be my kind of unicorn organization of, we don't need a governance committee because we all understand it so well. That'll never happen because we're people, but it would be nice.
But it certainly sounds like for striving for having governance be integrated within the development deployment process in everything that we already do is where we need to go with this. And you're reminding me of quality control efforts within automobile manufacturers, whereby thinking of Toyota, where quality, this is probably misrepresenting them, but quality isn't a separate thing. Yes, there might be people who are tasked with quality control tasks. There are quality control processes, but it is so embedded in the process that everybody from design, manufacturing onwards has a quality mindset and is looking for opportunities to improve quality. That's roughly what we should be striving for when it comes to development and deployment of AI, if I understand you correctly.
I would even, I don't want to derail this podcast getting into a totally different topic, but if you think of that quality control manufacturing use case, right, you get to a point where some of these things are so repetitive and manual. Now we're moving to automation, right? So if we're developing chips or manufacturing pharmaceuticals, name it, right? There's a lot of image processing that goes into that and various machine learning checkpoints and gates that are now heavily automated. There's still some manual kind of checking there and touch points, but we're moving to more of an automated system. And I think AI governance, where we could potentially go with this, right, as you start thinking about systems of agents, right? It's not too far-fetched to start thinking about an agent that is familiar with certain regulations within your state, an agent that's knowledgeable of regulations and guidance within the country you're working in, potentially other agents for other geographies and areas that you're in, and then that are knowledgeable about subsets of the work, right? Data and the data cleaning, and these systems would essentially, move us more to an automated sense. I don't think it'll ever be fully kind of automated. I think there's some need for manual checks and kind of driving that. But, I definitely see the level of automation starting to grow in this area. And that there's some benefit to that too, in the sense that today, especially with AI governance in banking and finance, there's actually policies within a lot of these organizations where the quants or the data scientists cannot even talk to the risk or compliance people. Then, there's regulations around what level of employee can talk to each other, and it has to go through email. And, if they're in person, sometimes the meetings have to be recorded. There's quite a lot that goes in. There's essentially a wall between those two organizations. And I think automation and some of this can start making that more effective, knowing that you can't talk to this group, but there's some automation that you're pinging there against that wall. So once you get to the point of, throwing it over the wall, there's not as much risk there. That's my rant on where agents might come into play here, but another topic we'll be thinking about a lot.
Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of worry by folks about when you say automation, that will mean less human oversight. But it sounds like in this context, so much of the manual effort is spent on non-value added activities that there isn't a whole lot of space and opportunity for meaningful human governance and control and mitigation. So it's all sunk into the difficulties of communication, the difficulties of collaboration, the manual effort in reproducing work and in documentation. And there's very little opportunity there to effectively control and guide and correct. Versus if we had more automation, we would be able to free up and shift tasks from those very manual, labor intensive and low value added ones to ones where folks can actually focus in and maybe have better attention on the actual places where they're risk.
80-20 rule, 80% of the work can probably may be automated, but the 20% that can't, that deserves more attention anyway. So freeing up people's time makes them more effective at the pieces that really need the time allocated to.
We talked a little bit about data governance. I guess I'm curious, there's been a long history of folks certainly working on data governance, data lineage, on privacy and regulatory concerns around data. What is the link there between data governance efforts and AI governance effort? Usually I'm seeing in organizations that you sort of fall off a governance cliff once you move past the data, and all of a sudden what people did with the data is a black hole that people have very little visibility and no auditability over. Is there any value in taking your existing data governance efforts and expanding those in the AI to cover more of the AI life cycle? Or is there such frictions there and there's such a different focus there that, well, actually you should be thinking about this probably either parallel or maybe even going the opposite direction, starting with the AI lifecycle and then working your way back to how you integrate into the data governance activities that your company's doing?
I think they're tangential. They're definitely separate in a lot of ways, but they're tangential and they do touch each other in a few areas as well. So big part of data governance is who can access what, right? So I don't want just any random old person being able to come in and look at PCI. You do not need to see other people's credit card information. It's locked down. If you need access to it, you have to ask for it and give me a reason why. That's the core of data governance in my mind. Analytics and ML, AI governance is about how you use that data. And to your point, yeah, it does feel like it goes off a cliff sometimes. But part of that governance program is the data governance, right? So that's why I say that they do touch each other quite a bit. Is because it's generally your data governance is the first stage of governance practices that you are likely going to have to, in a derogatory fashion, jump through some hoops to get through to do your work. It's there for a reason. It's critical. And then, Jared was sharing the story about understanding what things are correlated to each other, right? So that when you ask for certain variables from your data warehouse and you didn't realize that they were correlated to something you shouldn't be using, that's part of governance as well, right? Knowing the relationship between those variables before you get in lineage and metadata analysis and stuff like that. So my answer is maybe a bit of a non-answer, which is yeah, they are very separate from each other in a lot of ways. They definitely influence each other in a lot of ways. And those influences on each other and those relationships with each other are very tightly coupled to how you consume the data inside of an ML or an AI process. And so your policies, your internal policies, need to be aware of that as well.
It sounds like you probably shouldn't be thinking about this as an easy bolt-on to your existing data governance activities, that this is an easy additional set of responsibilities for your data governance team here versus, no, actually, this is very complicated and will require a lot of effort and potentially expertise and stakeholders that the data governance team may not be used to working with or may not have expertise over.
Yeah, I mean, my very serious answer is this is hard and you should take it seriously. My maybe less serious answer is this is hard, you should take it seriously because I need to stay in a job. So, if it was easy, I would have to be doing something else. But no, it's very difficult. It does take nuance. It takes conversations. And that's why you have to bring multiple people in and get different perspectives and clear your own biases by talking to people and including other stakeholders so that you can achieve the right things according to your personal and company values.
Excellent. Well, thinking about how this is going to evolve, it doesn't sound like this is going to get any easier, both because of increasing legislation, but also increasing technological development and new use cases and new techniques and methods that we're going to be leveraging. Any other thoughts when it comes to what folks can expect when it comes to governance?
I disagree with that statement, actually. It is going to get easier. And I say that is because, we're doing more complex things, but those same technologies that are causing us to take a step back and say, is this the right thing to do, can also be leveraged to lighten loads later on, right? Jared was pointing out, there are, I'll say obvious, not trivial, but obvious places where agents can help us a lot and augment the workload and automate 80% of it away. So I think what's going to happen is that it's not that it's going to get easier or harder. It's we're going to get the opportunity to focus on the hard stuff. The easy stuff that takes a lot of time and is just a mental or a focus suck can go away, and you can focus on the things that are difficult and require humans nuance and kind of insights into things. So I think I'll disagree with that statement entirely that it's going to get harder. I think it's going to get easier.
It may get harder for folks that build up a very rigid system now. That's the one downside of kind of automation. If you lock that automation, so a lot when you talk about data governance, a lot of data technologies are very specific to how that data is being stored and how it's being cataloged. how it's being used, right? So as you start thinking about data lineage and those type of tools, databases a lot of times are built almost as a magnet to bring the data into that system. There are some tools now that are obviously a little bit more open, but at the end of the day, they kind of pull you into that, right? So if you kind of think about that also on the AI governance more, once you get into the actual usage of that data, if you start picking technologies that are very closed and require very specific either patents or packages and so forth, that's where I could see people, getting in trouble, because you're going to go down a path that's going to heavily restrict you. And then you're going to be where we were 10 years ago and wanting to use the SVMs, neural nets, whatever that's going to be the next 10 years, and be at that stuck point. So I think, making sure that now what you're building in has the flexibility to, number one, bring in more policies as regulations and requirements come out, but also thinking about how the data scientists are working, making sure it's open where they can pull in various different technologies. I remember, 20 years ago, everything I did was SAS. And then for a long time there, it was all R, and now it's all Python, right? So just understanding that technology packages, approaches are changing, and start to think about that in terms of the flexibility of your governance system that you're setting up, so that when the next technology comes, it's not a roadblock for your organization.
Excellent. So it can be easier as long as you do it right, and that you build in that flexibility from the get-go. In terms of parting advice, is there something that you would recommend, some place where they should get started, or places that they should be looking in order to find more information or more tools that can help them on this journey?
I think a good place to start is understanding where you are in your AI governance journey, right? And I think Dylan could probably talk more to this than I can, but starting with an audit, right? Let's understand where we are from picking up on regulations, laws, and so forth. So coming in from the risk governance side, but then also how your team's working across the entire life cycle of data through model deployment and measurement and production, and that whole piece right there. Getting an understanding of where the organization is today, I think, is a good starting point. And I'll kick this over to Dylan. He probably has more ideas and around that piece, and then where you go from there.
No, I'm laughing because my initial reaction is, you go do a gap analysis, which is what you just described, right? I think you need to do that for your organization if you're responsible for it, but maybe even take a further step back and kind of maybe do that personal gap analysis on your own understandings as well of how to build and maybe design a program at all. Luckily, I think for everyone right now is that the internet's out there, and there are plenty of people who have opinions. Some are good, some are better. And going out and reading, honestly, go find somebody you trust, go find a source that you trust, and go read and go figure out where you sit on your own personal understandings, as well as where your organization sits with the organization's understandings. I think the biggest thing for people is if you're going to go try to drive something like this, my biggest piece of advice is you either need to have the capital to burn to make it happen, or get those people aligned to you. You need to have friends. You need to have allies in order to make this happen. It's not something a person can do by themselves. I mean, unless you are the CEO, and even then, you may have an entrenched, recalcitrant group if that you're fighting against. So, go do that. Do your gap analysis as a group, and kind of do it openly. I would say is just my biggest piece of advice. Is if everyone knows what you're doing and why you're doing it, it'll make the results better, and it'll make your outcomes better as a whole.
And naturally, it'd be entirely remiss of us if we did not go in and also mention that we have a host of resources on the Domino website that can help you on this. We've got ebooks, we've got self-assessment tools, and naturally, we also have this platform and professional services that tackle this regularly for our customers. Dylan, Jared, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Data Science Leaders from Domino Data Lab. If you found our discussion insightful, be sure to subscribe to never miss an episode. Your support helps us deliver cutting-edge content and keep the data science community informed and inspired. We appreciate every review. Until next time.